They thought she was nobody. Just another pair of hands pushing a mop across the sterile floors of Redstone Air Force Base, invisible to the officers who strode past without a second glance. But when enemy fighters tore through the morning sky and chaos erupted across the tarmac, the woman they'd dismissed as mere maintenance staff would become their only hope for survival. This is the story of how Lieutenant Commander Amara Sterling stopped hiding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Hangar 7 hummed their familiar drone as Amara Sterling wrung out her mop for the 4th time that morning. At 42, she developed a rhythm to the work that others might find mind-numbing. Dip, wring, sweep, repeat. The floors of the hangar had to shine like glass. Regulations demanded it. And Amara had always followed regulations. She worked the night shift at Redstone, the sprawling military installation nestled in the Nevada high desert, 30 miles from anything resembling civilization. The base housed 2 full fighter squadrons, a training facility, and enough brass to make any enlisted person nervous. Amara preferred working when they were mostly gone. When the hangar belonged to the silence and the sleeping aircraft, most people at Redstone knew her as the quiet woman who arrived at 10 p.m. and left at 6 a.m. Her gray custodial uniform always pressed, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been there for 18 months, ever since she'd driven across 3 states looking for somewhere that felt far enough from her past. Evening. Sterling called out Technical Sergeant Dwight Ramirez as he passed through the hangar. He was one of the maintenance crew chiefs, a decent man who actually acknowledged the custodial staff. Got that F-16 ready for tomorrow's inspection? Floors are spotless, Amara replied, not looking up from her work. Replace the bulb in the northwest corner too. Was flickering. Ramirez paused, watching her move around the fighter jet with practiced efficiency. There was something about the way Sterling worked around the aircraft that always caught his attention. She never bumped into anything, never disturbed equipment, moved through the tight spaces around the jets like someone who understood exactly how much clearance each surface needed. You ever work around planes before this job? He asked casually. Picked things up over the years, Amara said, her standard response to questions that probed too close. You see enough of something, you learn how it works. What Ramirez didn't know, what nobody at Redstone knew, was that Amara had spent 14 years as a naval aviator. She'd flown FA-18 Super Hornets off the deck of the USS Constellation, accumulating over 1,500 hours of flight time, including 2 combat deployments in hostile airspace. She'd been one of only 37 women to ever qualify as a Top Gun instructor, teaching the Navy's most elite pilots advanced tactical maneuvers. She'd walked away from all of it in 2022, after a mission over the Persian Gulf went sideways. Her wingman, Lieutenant Kai Nakamura, had been shot down by enemy surface-to-air missiles while Amara provided cover. She'd watched his ejection, watched his chute deploy, and then watched helplessly as enemy forces captured him before rescue could arrive. The official report said she'd followed protocol perfectly, but Amara knew better. She'd hesitated for 3 seconds before calling in his position. 3 seconds where she'd frozen trying to assess if she could attempt to rescue herself. Nakamura spent 8 months as a prisoner of war before being released. He survived, but those 3 seconds haunted Amara every night. She'd resigned her commission immediately after his return, unable to face him or herself in the mirror while wearing the uniform. The custodial work at Redstone was penance. Every night she cleaned around the aircraft she'd once commanded, reminding herself of what she'd lost and why she deserved this quiet, invisible life. Well, you do good work, Ramirez said, heading toward his office. Keep it up. Amara continued mopping, her eyes automatically tracking the F-16's wing configuration, noting the weapon's loadout. observing the maintenance tags that indicated a hydraulic system check was scheduled. Old habits died hard. Even as a janitor, she couldn't stop reading aircraft the way other people read books. Around midnight, she moved to the break room to empty trash bins. The television mounted in the corner was tuned to the news, volume low. She normally ignored it, but something about the anchor's urgent tone made her glance up. Tensions continued to escalate in the South China Sea, where unidentified aircraft had been conducting aggressive maneuvers near Allied shipping lanes. Pentagon officials say they're monitoring the situation closely, but characterize the incursions as routine provocations. Amara's trained eye caught the grainy footage playing in the corner of the screen. Those weren't routine flight patterns. The aircraft were conducting what looked like suppression runs, the kind of approach vectors you'd use before a coordinated strike. She'd flown those same patterns dozens of times in training. She shook her head and returned to her trash bins. Not her problem anymore. She'd given up the right to have opinions about military aviation when she'd turned in her wing stop by 3 a.m. The hangar was immaculate. Amara was restocking cleaning supplies in the utility closet when she heard raised voices from the administrative offices. Base Commander Colonel Theodore Vance had arrived unexpectedly, his presence drawing several officers from their night duties. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I don't care what Washington says about diplomatic solutions, Vance's voice carried across the hangar floor. Those birds in the South China Sea are getting bolder. I want our squadrons on heightened alert starting immediately. Amara recognized the tension in his voice. She'd heard that same edge from commanders before combat operations. The weight of responsibility for lives that might be at risk. She finished stocking the closet and moved to clean the administrative wing, keeping her head down as officers hurried past with printouts and tactical displays. Through an open door, she glimpsed a map of the Pacific Theater, with multiple aircraft positions marked in red. Sterling. A sharp voice made her turn. Lieutenant Jessica Pham, the base operations officer, stood in the doorway with an expression of irritation. What are you doing in this area? Administrative wing is off limits during alert status. Sorry, ma'am, Amara said quietly, gripping her mop handle. Just doing my assigned rounds. I can come back later. See that you do. And next time, pay attention to the security postings. Pham dismissed her with a wave and closed the door. Amara retreated to the main hangar, the familiar sting of dismissal settling in her chest. To officers like Pham, she was just the help, someone who existed to keep floors clean and stay out of the way of important work. It was safer that way, she reminded herself. Better to be invisible than to risk the responsibility of being seen. As she pushed her cleaning cart toward the next section, she paused beside one of the F-16s. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the fuselage, fingers stopping an inch from the smooth metal. She could feel the familiar pull, the muscle memory of pre-flight checks and weapon systems diagnostics. 14 years of training didn't just disappear because you took off the uniform. Just a janitor, she whispered to herself, pulling her hand back. That's all you are now. But even as she said it, her eyes were tracking the hangar's defensive positions, noting sight lines and calculating response times with the automatic precision of someone trained to think tactically. Some skills never faded. They just waited, dormant, for the moment when they'd be needed again. Amara didn't know it yet. But that moment was less than 12 hours away. The morning sun blazed across Redstone Air Force Base with the kind of intensity that made the tarmac shimmer like water. Amara had just finished her shift, changed out of her custodial uniform into civilian clothes, worn jeans, and a faded university sweatshirt, when the convoy of black SUVs rolled through the main gate. She was walking toward the parking lot, her eyes half closed against the glare, when the vehicles passed. Through the tinted windows of the lead SUV, She caught a glimpse of crisp uniforms and the gleam of multiple stars on shoulders. Brass, high-ranking brass dot by the time she reached her 15-year-old Honda Civic. The base intercom crackled to life. All personnel report to Hangar 1 for mandatory assembly at 0900 hours. Repeat, all personnel to Hangar 1 at 0900. Amara frowned. Mandatory assembly meant everyone, including custodial staff. She checked her watch, 6:47 a.m. She had 2 hours to grab breakfast and a shower at her small apartment in the nearby town of Dustwell before returning to base by 9 o'clock. Hangar 1 was packed with nearly 400 personnel pilots, maintenance crews, administrative staff, security forces, and support personnel, including the dozen members of the custodial team. Amara stood at the back with her fellow janitors, all of them looking uncomfortable in their gray uniforms among the sea of military dress blues and flight suits. Colonel Vance stood at the front of the hangar, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man Amara recognized immediately from military publications, General Curtis Aldridge. 3 stars gleaming on his shoulders, commander of all tactical air operations for the Western Theater. His reputation preceded him, a decorated combat veteran with over 30 years of service. Known for his strict adherence to protocol and his legendary intolerance for anything he deemed civilian interference in military operations. Attention! Vance's voice boomed across the hangar, and the military personnel snapped to rigid posture. The civilian contractors and custodial staff straightened awkwardly. Unsure of the proper response, General Aldridge stepped forward, his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes scanning the assembled crowd with the kind of scrutiny that made people check if their uniforms were straight. "I'll make this brief," Aldridge began, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. As of 0600 this morning, Redstone Air Force Base has been designated a forward tactical staging area for Operation Desert Shield. Intelligence indicates escalating hostile activity in the Pacific Theater that requires immediate readiness posture. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Amara felt her pulse quicken despite herself. Desert Shield protocols meant they were one step away from active combat operations. "This base will undergo immediate restructuring," Aldridge continued. "I will personally oversee all tactical operations. Training schedules are suspended. All aircraft will be reconfigured for combat loadouts. And effective immediately, we're implementing enhanced security protocols." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the hangar with particular attention to the civilian personnel clustered at the back. "Let me be crystal clear about something," Aldridge said, his tone hardening. "This is a military installation preparing for potential combat operations. That means military personnel conducting military operations according to military standards. I've reviewed this base's personnel files, and I'm frankly disturbed by the level of civilian integration into sensitive areas." Amara felt several people around her shift uncomfortably. "Civilian contractors will be restricted to designated zones only. No unauthorized personnel in hangars during aircraft preparation. No civilian access to operational briefings, tactical displays, or communication centers. And absolutely no unsolicited input on military procedures from anyone not qualified to provide it." The words landed like a slap. Amara had heard this speech before years ago, from officers who believed that anyone without stars on their shoulders had nothing valuable to contribute. It was the kind of thinking that got people killed because good ideas were ignored based on who suggested them rather than their merit. "Sir," Colonel Vance spoke up carefully, "some of our civilian contractors have extensive experience with aircraft maintenance. They've been integral to our operations." "Colonel, I appreciate your facilities protocols," Aldridge replied with barely concealed condescension. "But appreciation for civilian work ethic doesn't change security requirements. These people, He gestured vaguely toward the back of the hangar. "May be adequate for peacetime maintenance, but we're preparing for war. I need personnel with military training, military discipline, and military accountability." Amara watched Technical Sergeant Ramirez glance back at the custodial staff with an apologetic expression. He'd worked with them long enough to know their value. But he wasn't about to contradict a 3-star general. "Furthermore," Aldridge continued, "I'm bringing in my own maintenance teams from Nellis Air Force Base. They have security clearances and combat preparation experience. Local civilian staff will be reassigned to non-essential duties only." Non-essential. The words stung more than Amara expected. She'd spent 18 months keeping these hangars running, maintaining the spaces where these pilots prepared for flight, ensuring their environment met every safety standard. Now she was being classified as non-essential by someone who'd been on base for less than 3 hours. "New duty rosters will be posted by 1300 hours, Aldridge announced. Dismissed. The crowd began to disperse, military personnel moving with purpose toward their assignments, while the civilian workers clustered together, exchanging worried glances. Amara started toward the exit, but a sharp voice stopped her. "You there. Custodial staff." She turned to find Aldridge striding toward the small group of janitors, Colonel Vance trailing behind him looking uncomfortable. "Yes, sir?" replied Marcus Trent, the custodial supervisor, a retired Air Force sergeant who'd taken the civilian job after his medical discharge. "I want it understood that your teams are to stay completely clear of active operational areas," Aldridge said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Hangars are off-limits during aircraft prep. Break rooms and administrative wings are restricted during briefings. You'll work around our schedule, not the other way around." "Sir, with respect," Trent began. "We have protocols for maintaining these facilities that require—" "Your protocols are now secondary to operational security," Aldridge cut him off. "If areas need cleaning, you'll submit requests through proper channels and wait for approval. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Trent replied quietly, his jaw tight. Aldridge's eyes scanned the group of janitors, dismissing each of them with barely a glance. When his gaze passed over Amara, there was nothing in his expression but the same casual dismissal he'd shown the others. To him, she was just another pair of hands holding a mop, irrelevant to the important work of military aviation. "Colonel Vance," Aldridge said, turning away from the custodial staff as if they'd ceased to exist, "I want a full briefing on your squadron readiness in 20 minutes. And get those civilian contractors cleared out of Hangar 7. My advance team needs that space for tactical planning." As Aldridge walked away, Trent shook his head. "Well, folks, looks like we're about to have a lot of downtime. Maybe catch up on supply inventory?" The other janitors dispersed, but Amara lingered, watching through the hangar doors as Aldridge's team began moving in equipment tactical displays, communications arrays, weapons systems diagnostics. She recognized every piece of equipment, knew exactly what each component was for, and could read the preparation like a book. They weren't just preparing for potential conflict. They were preparing for imminent engagement. "Sterling, you coming?" Trent called from the doorway. "Yeah, sorry," Amara replied, forcing herself to look away from the tactical setup as she walked toward the custodial office. She passed a group of young pilots clustered near Hangar 3, their voices carrying in the desert morning. "Did you see the general's service record?" one of them was saying. "Flew combat missions in 3 different theaters. The man's a legend." "Maybe, but did you hear what he said about civilian contractors? My maintenance chief has 15 years of experience, and Aldridge just basically called him incompetent." "He's not wrong, though," another pilot chimed in. "Military operations need military standards. Can't have civilians thinking they understand combat aviation just because they've read some manuals." The comment hit closer than they knew. Amara kept walking, head down, invisible once again. In the custodial office, Trent was already reviewing the new restrictions list that had been distributed. "This is going to be a nightmare," he muttered. "They want us to stay out of the hangars but maintain them. How exactly are we supposed to do that?" "We work around them," Amara said quietly. "Early mornings, late nights, whenever they're not using the space." Trent looked at her curiously. "You're taking this pretty calmly. Most of the others are ready to quit." "It's just another obstacle," Amara replied, though inside she felt the familiar frustration building. Another authority figure making decisions based on assumptions rather than information. Another situation where expertise would be dismissed because it came from the wrong source. She'd seen this pattern before, and she knew exactly how it ended. Men like Aldridge operated in rigid hierarchies where rank mattered more than capability. Eventually, that thinking created blind spots. And in military aviation, blind spots got people killed, but that wasn't her problem anymore. She'd given up the right to care about tactical decisions when she'd turned in her wings. Now she was just a janitor, non-essential personnel who cleaned floors and stayed out of the way. At least. That's what she kept telling herself. As she left the office to begin her restricted duties. Amara didn't notice Technical Sergeant Ramirez watching her from across the tarmac, a thoughtful expression on his face. He'd seen something in her eyes during Aldridge's speech. Something that didn't match the humble demeanor of a custodial worker. It was the look of someone who'd been in command before and recognized exactly what kind of leader had just taken control of Redstone Air Force Base. The trouble started 3 days into General Aldridge's command when the first tactical briefing revealed just how little he understood about Redstone's unique operational challenges. Amara was emptying trash bins in the administrative corridor, one of the few tasks still permitted under the new restrictions, when she overheard the heated discussion coming from the operations center. The door had been left partially open, and voices carried clearly into the hallway. "General, with respect, the desert wind patterns in this region create severe turbulence between 0800 and 1200 hours, Colonel Vance was saying. "We've documented wind shear incidents that..." "Colonel, I've flown in desert conditions across 3 continents, Aldridge interrupted. "Standard atmospheric turbulence is factored into all flight training. Your pilots need to adapt to combat conditions, not avoid them." "Sir, this isn't standard turbulence. The mountain ranges create downdrafts that have grounded aircraft. We lost an F-16 to wind shear just 8 months ago during a routine patrol. Then your pilot wasn't properly trained. My squadrons from Nellis have operated in worse conditions without incident." Amara paused in the hallway, her hand gripping the trash bin tighter than necessary. She knew exactly what Vance was talking about. The unique geography around Redstone, surrounded by the Crimson Ridge mountains to the east and the sandstone flats to the west, created a wind tunnel effect during late morning hours. The phenomenon was well documented in local flight operations, and every pilot stationed here long-term knew to avoid certain approach vectors during peak heating hours. But Aldridge was new. He was operating on assumptions based on other desert environments without understanding Redstone's specific conditions. Through the open door, she could see the tactical display showing planned flight operations. Her eyes immediately caught the problem. Morning patrol routes scheduled for 10 a.m. using eastern approach vectors that would put aircraft directly into the worst wind shear zones. She should walk away. This wasn't her responsibility anymore, but her feet wouldn't move. "Sir," Vance tried again, "perhaps we could consult with personnel who have extensive experience with local conditions." "Colonel, I don't need to consult with anyone. I need pilots who can execute orders in challenging conditions. If your people can't handle wind, they have no business flying combat missions." Amara forced herself to continue down the hallway, the bad flight plan burning in her memory like acid. It wasn't just dangerous, it was predictably preventably dangerous. The kind of decision that happened when authority figures refused to acknowledge information that contradicted their assumptions. Over the next week, the pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency. Technical Sergeant Ramirez approached Amara in the break room on Thursday afternoon, his face troubled. "Sterling, you still friends with anyone in base operations?" "Not really," Amara replied, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Why?" "The General's new maintenance protocols are going to cause problems. He's demanding faster turnaround times on aircraft prep, but he's cutting the safety check sequences. Says they're unnecessary redundancies that slow operations." Amara's head snapped up. "Which safety checks?" "Hydraulic system verification, backup instrument calibration, weapons systems diagnostics, basically anything he considers peacetime overcaution." Ramirez shook his head. "I tried explaining to his maintenance chief that those checks exist because we've had failures, but got told I was being overcautious. Have you documented your concerns?" "Filed 3 separate reports. Haven't heard back on any of them." That evening, Amara was cleaning the windows in Hangar 5 when she witnessed another incident. A group of pilots were reviewing flight plans for the next day's exercises when Lieutenant Commander Daniel Cross, one of Redstone's most experienced pilots, raised a concern. "General, these nighttime low-altitude runs over the sandstone flats, we've documented significant bird strike risks in that area after sunset. Migrating flocks use those corridors during this season." Aldridge barely looked up from his tablet. "Commander, enemy aircraft don't avoid areas because of bird migration patterns. Your people need to train in realistic conditions." "Sir, I'm not suggesting we avoid training. I'm suggesting we adjust the flight paths by 3 miles to reduce unnecessary risk while maintaining the training value." "What I'm hearing, Commander, is that you're looking for reasons to avoid challenging flight operations. That's exactly the kind of peacetime thinking that gets pilots killed in combat." Aldridge's tone was dismissive. "The flight plan stands as written." Cross's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." From her position near the windows, Amara could see the frustration on the pilots' faces. They knew their operational environment. They understood the specific risks of their territory. But Aldridge was steamrolling over their expertise with the confidence of someone who believed his rank made him infallible. She caught Ramirez watching her. Noticed the way her hand had frozen mid-wipe on the glass. The tension in her shoulders that didn't match a janitor's casual interest. "You okay, Sterling?" he asked quietly. "Fine," she replied, forcing herself to continue cleaning. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine. Every ignored warning, every dismissed safety concern, every arrogant assumption was building toward something catastrophic. She could feel it the way a combat pilot feels the moment before an enemy locks on, that split second of recognition before everything goes wrong. The breaking point came on Monday morning. Amara arrived for her shift at 6 a.m. to find the base on high alert. Overnight intelligence had detected unusual aircraft movements in international airspace 400 miles west of Redstone. The pattern suggested reconnaissance flights, possibly probing air defense responses. General Aldridge had ordered immediate heightened readiness. All combat aircraft were to be fueled, armed, and ready for launch within 2 hours. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone with operational experience. The combination of rushed preparations, skipped safety protocols, and morning desert wind conditions created a perfect storm of risk factors. Amara was mopping the administrative corridor when she heard Colonel Vance making one more attempt. "General, I'm requesting a 2-hour delay on the alert launch window." "The weather conditions. Request denied," Aldridge snapped. "We don't delay combat readiness because of weather reports. Every aircraft launches at 0800 as scheduled." "Sir, the wind shear during that window." "Colonel, are you refusing to follow orders?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. No, sir, Vance finally replied, his voice tight. All aircraft will launch at 0800. Amara's hands gripped the mop handle so hard her knuckles turned white. 8 o'clock was the absolute worst time for Eastern launches from Redstone. The desert wind effect would be at peak intensity, the downdrafts would be severe, and the rushed maintenance meant aircraft systems might not be fully verified. She abandoned her mop and walked quickly toward the maintenance offices. Ramirez was there, coordinating the frantic preparation work. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "have all the aircraft completed full hydraulic systems checks?" He looked at her with surprise. "How do you know about hydraulic protocols?" "Just answer the question." "No, General's orders were to prioritize weapons loading and fuel. He said secondary system checks could be completed after launch." "After launch?" "When problems would be discovered in the air, with pilots at risk. You need to ground any aircraft that hasn't completed full safety verification," Amara said urgently. Ramirez stared at her. "Sterling, what's going on?" "You're talking like—" He paused, really looking at her for the first time. "Who are you?" Before she could answer, Lieutenant Pham appeared in the doorway. "What's a custodial worker doing in the maintenance offices during alert status?" Her voice was sharp with authority. "This area is restricted. I was just—" Amara began. "You were just leaving," Pham interrupted. "Immediately. And Sergeant Ramirez, I suggest you focus on actual operational personnel rather than entertaining concerns from cleaning staff." The dismissal was absolute. Amara saw Ramirez's face flush with embarrassment at being reprimanded, saw him turn back to his checklists without meeting her eyes. She walked back to the corridor, her mind racing. She could push harder, could reveal who she was, could force them to listen. But 18 months of hiding, 18 months of penance for the 3 seconds that cost Nakamura his freedom, held her back. This wasn't her responsibility. She'd given up the right to make these decisions, but as she watched pilots rushing toward their aircraft, saw the maintenance crews working frantically under impossible time constraints, heard the wind already beginning to pick up across the tarmac, Amara felt the weight of knowledge pressing down on her chest. She knew what was going to happen at 8 o'clock. Knew it with the certainty of 1,500 flight hours and 14 years of combat experience. Knew it the way you know the sun will rise. Inevitable and undeniable. Someone was going to die this morning. And General Aldridge, in his arrogance and his absolute confidence in his own expertise, was about to learn the difference between knowing how to fly and understanding where you're flying. Amara pulled out her phone and did the only thing she could do without revealing herself. She sent an anonymous message to the base weather service, requesting urgent verification of wind shear conditions for the 8 o'clock launch window. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But it was all she could do without becoming the person she'd promised herself. She'd never be again the commander whose decisions put lives at risk. At 7:45 a.m. She stood at the edge of the tarmac, ostensibly sweeping debris from the walkway, watching 12 F-16 Fighting Falcons prepare for launch. Their engines screamed to life, drowning out everything except the pounding of her own heart. 15 minutes, until disaster. And nobody with the authority to stop it was listening. The morning air shimmered with heat waves even before 8 a.m. The desert already baking under a merciless sun. Amara stood near the perimeter fence, her cleaning cart abandoned. Every muscle in her body coiled with tension as she watched the flight line prepare for launch. 12 F-16s sat on the tarmac, their pilots already strapped in, cockpit canopies beginning to lower. She could see the weapons loaded under each wing-live ordnance for what Aldridge called realistic combat readiness training. The general himself stood in the control tower, visible through the windows, radiating confidence as he prepared to demonstrate Redstone's enhanced operational capability. At 7:52 a.m. Amara made her decision. She couldn't stop the launch. She didn't have the authority, didn't have the credentials that anyone would recognize. Didn't have any power to override a 3-star general's direct orders. But she could get the information to someone who might still be able to do something. She pulled out her phone and called the weather office directly. Redstone Weather Service. Airman Chun speaking. This is an urgent request for immediate wind shear data verification for eastern launch vectors, Amara said, keeping her voice steady and professional. Current launch window shows extreme risk conditions. Ma'am, who is this calling? Someone who knows what they're talking about. Check your anemometer readings for the eastern approach corridor. Check them right now. There was a pause, the sound of keyboard clicks. Ma'am, our readings show elevated wind activity, but within acceptable parameters for your readings are wrong, Amara interrupted. You're measuring surface winds. The shear is happening at altitude, between the thermal layer and the mountain downdraft zone. If you have access to upper atmosphere data, check the gradient between 2,000 and 5,000 feet. Another pause, longer this time. How do you know about our upper atmosphere monitoring? Because I used to brief pilots on exactly this kind of weather data. Please just check it. More keyboard sounds, then a sharp intake of breath. Jesus, the gradient is. Ma'am, this is a 40-knot differential. That's severe shear conditions. I know. Who can you call to delay the launch? I don't have authority to. Then find someone who does. You have 6 minutes. Amara hung up and immediately called the tower operations desk. A different voice answered. Tower operations, Sergeant Willis. Sergeant, I need you to relay an urgent weather advisory to General Aldridge. Wind shear conditions in the eastern corridor are, ma'am. I can't interrupt the general during launch operations without proper authorization. Who is this? My name doesn't matter. What matters is that if those aircraft launch on eastern vectors in the next 5 minutes, you're going to have pilots fighting severe turbulence with incompletely verified aircraft systems. Ma'am, are you qualified to make that assessment? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Amara could end this right now. Could tell them exactly who she was. Could use her credentials to force them to listen. But doing so meant revealing everything. Meant stepping back into the world of command decisions and life or death choices she'd sworn to leave behind. Just deliver the message, she said quietly. And hung up. She watched the tower, saw a figure, probably Willis, approach the window where Aldridge stood. Saw him speak, saw Aldridge's dismissive wave without even turning around. 7:56 M. Amara's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She started walking toward the flight line, knowing security would stop her before she got close, knowing it was futile. But unable to stand still while this unfolded, Technical Sergeant Ramirez intercepted her halfway across the tarmac. Sterling, what are you doing? Civilians aren't allowed on the flight line during operations. Those aircraft aren't ready, Amara said, her voice urgent. The maintenance protocols were rushed. The weather conditions are dangerous. Someone needs to abort this launch. Ramirez stared at her, and she saw the moment his professional skepticism cracked. How do you know our maintenance protocols? Because I've prepped more aircraft for combat than everyone on this base combined, she said, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. And I've flown in conditions exactly like these enough times to know what's about to happen. You've flown? You're a pilot? I was a pilot. Now I'm trying to stop people from dying. Will you help me or not? Before Ramirez could respond, Lieutenant Pham's voice cut across the tarmac. Security! We have an unauthorized person on the flight line. 2 Air Force security personnel started jogging toward them, 7:58 a.m. Sergeant, please, Amara said desperately. You know something's wrong. You've been on this base long enough to recognize dangerous conditions when you see them. Ramirez looked torn, his eyes darting between Amara and the approaching security forces. Even if I believed you, I can't override a general's orders. Nobody can. The security personnel reached them. "Ma'am, you need to clear this area immediately." Amara pulled away from their reaching hands and did the only thing left to do. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted toward the tower at the top of her lungs. "General Aldridge, abort the launch. Wind shear conditions are critical." Her voice carried across the tarmac, amplified by desperation and 14 years of command presence. In the tower, she saw Aldridge turn, saw his face register shock and then anger at the interruption. The security personnel grabbed her arms. "Ma'am, you're in violation of base security. You need to come with us. Eastern approach vectors are compromised," she shouted, even as they pulled her back. "The aircraft systems aren't fully verified. You're sending them into a trap." In the cockpit of the lead F-16, she could see the pilot Lieutenant Commander Cross turning his head toward the commotion. Other pilots were looking too, confused by the disturbance. Aldridge's voice boomed over the tower's external speakers. "Ignore that disturbance. All aircraft, you are cleared for launch. Execute on my mark." 7:59 a.m., Amara stopped fighting the security personnel and instead locked eyes with Cross through his cockpit canopy. He was close enough that she could see his face, could see him trying to figure out who was making this desperate warning. She made a decision that would expose everything. With her hands still restrained, she brought them up to her chest and formed them into a series of hand signals, tactical aviation gestures that only military pilots would recognize. The signal spelled out a simple message: abort, shear, danger. Cross's eyes widened. Those signals weren't public knowledge. They weren't something a civilian janitor would know. His hand moved toward his radio. "General, this is Lead Bird. Request clarification on launch authorization." Aldridge's voice came back irritated. "Lead Bird, you have full authorization. What's the problem?" "Sir, there's a civilian on the tarmac using military tactical signals. She's warning about wind shear conditions." "A civilian using military signals?" Aldridge's skepticism was audible. "Impossible. Someone's playing games. All aircraft, you are cleared for immediate launch. That's a direct order." Cross hesitated, his training warring with his instincts. Amara could see it in his posture, the tension of a pilot who knows something is wrong but can't articulate why. "Sir," Cross tried one more time. "Request permission to delay launch by 15 minutes to verify weather conditions." "Negative." Aldridge's patience had evaporated. "Lead Bird, you will execute your launch order now, or I will have you removed from flight status for insubordination." 8 a.m. The tower clock hit the hour mark with digital precision. "All aircraft, this is Lead Bird," Cross said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Executing launch sequence. Follow my lead." The first F-16's engine roared to full power. The aircraft began rolling down the runway, picking up speed with the brutal acceleration that always made Amara's heart race. Within seconds, it rotated and lifted off, climbing steeply into the morning sky on an eastern vector that would take it directly through the wind shear zone. The second aircraft followed 30 seconds later. Then the third. Amara stopped struggling against the security personnel and just watched, feeling hollow. She'd tried everything short of revealing her complete identity, and it hadn't been enough. Now all she could do was witness the consequences of authority refusing to listen to experience. The radio on. Ramirez's belt crackled to life with Cross's voice. "Tower, Lead Bird reporting significant turbulence at 3,000 feet. Experiencing severe downdraft." Then, 6 seconds later, his voice came through again, tighter now, edged with concern. "Tower, I'm reading hydraulic pressure fluctuations. System showing intermittent response." Amara closed her eyes. The skipped maintenance checks. Exactly what she'd feared. "Lead Bird, maintain course," Aldridge ordered. "Minor turbulence is expected during..." "Tower, this is Bird 3. A different voice, younger, panicked. I've lost hydraulic assist. Controls are sluggish. I'm fighting severe wind shear, and the aircraft isn't responding properly. Suddenly, the radio erupted with multiple voices. Bird 5 experiencing massive downdraft. Altitude dropping. Bird 7, hydraulic warning lights. Something's wrong with the flight control system. Tower, this is Lead Bird. I'm declaring an emergency. All aircraft, abort training exercise and return to base immediately. Amara opened her eyes to see Ramirez staring at her with an expression of dawning horror and understanding. On the flight line, the remaining aircraft that hadn't yet launched were being held as pilots and ground crews, scrambled to respond to the emergency dot in the sky to the east. She could see the tiny shapes of the F-16s that had already launched, and they were flying erratically. Fighting conditions and mechanical issues simultaneously. The security personnel's grips on her arms had loosened. Their attention divided between restraining her and watching the crisis unfold. "Let her go," Ramirez said quietly. "Sergeant, we have orders to," I said. "Let her go." Ramirez's voice carried an authority that made them comply. She tried to stop this. She tried to warn everyone. As Amara's arms were released, the radio delivered the words everyone had been dreading. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Bird 3. Complete hydraulic failure. I've lost flight control. Aircraft is unresponsive. I'm ejecting. I'm ejecting." Across the base, alarms began to wail as emergency crews scrambled toward their vehicles. And in the tower, through the windows, Amara could see General Aldridge's face as he realized that his refusal to listen had just put his pilots in mortal danger. The warning had been ignored. Now came the consequences. The ejection seat fired with explosive force, sending Captain Ryan Torres rocketing out of Bird 3 at 400 miles per hour. His parachute deployed automatically at 3,000 feet. The canopy snapping open with a jarring deceleration that saved his life even as his F-16 tumbled toward the desert floor below. Amara watched the tiny speck of the parachute drift eastward, carried by the same brutal winds that had destroyed the aircraft's control systems. Behind her, emergency vehicles screamed across the tarmac, but she wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were fixed on the sky where 11 other F-16s were fighting for their lives. "All aircraft. This is Tower." Aldridge's voice came over the external speakers, and even he couldn't hide the strain now. "Return to base immediately. Use Western approach vectors. Repeat, Western vectors only." Smart. At least he was learning, even if the lesson was coming at catastrophic cost. "Tower, this is Lead Bird," Cross responded, his voice tight with concentration. "I'm showing hydraulic pressure at 60% and dropping. Request priority landing clearance. Lead Bird, you are cleared for immediate landing. Emergency crews standing by." Amara watched Cross's aircraft approach from the east, flying lower and slower than normal, clearly nursing damaged systems. The landing was rough. The F-16 hit the runway hard, bounced once, then settled with a screech of rubber that left black streaks across the concrete. But Cross maintained control, bringing the aircraft to a stop halfway down the runway, one safe. 11 still airborne with varying degrees of damage. "Tower, Bird 5 here. I've lost complete hydraulic assist. Flying on backup systems only. Controls are mushy as hell. Tower, Bird 7. My hydraulic pressure just dropped to 40%. How the hell did this happen to multiple aircraft?" Amara knew exactly how. The rushed maintenance protocols had skipped the full hydraulic system verification checks. In peacetime conditions, you might get away with it. The systems were robust and failures were rare. But combined with severe turbulence that put stress on every component, the marginally compromised systems were failing one by one. It was the kind of cascading failure that happened when you ignored safety protocols because you thought you knew better. Technical Sergeant Ramirez had pulled out his tablet and was frantically reviewing maintenance logs. "Oh my God," he whispered. 6 of the 12 aircraft launched with incomplete hydraulic checks. We flagged them for post-flight verification, but the general's orders were to launch regardless. "Post-flight verification," Amara said bitterly. "Because what could possibly go wrong?" Colonel Vance came running across the tarmac, his face flushed and furious. When he reached Amara and Ramirez, he was breathing hard. "Sergeant, I need those maintenance logs immediately." "And you," he turned to Amara, "who the hell are you really?" Nobody knows military tactical signals unless they've been trained. Nobody predicts hydraulic failures and wind shear conditions unless they have serious aviation background. Before Amara could answer, another voice cut across the radio. "Tower, this is Bird 9. I'm in serious trouble. Hydraulic failure just went total. I have no flight control authority. Aircraft is not responding." Amara's blood went cold. Total. Hydraulic failure in an F-16 meant the pilot had essentially no way to control the aircraft. The flight control surface's ailerons, elevators, rudder all depended on hydraulic pressure. Without it, the jet became a $30 million glider with terrible aerodynamics. "Bird 9, this is Tower," Aldridge said, and for the first time Amara heard real fear in his voice. "Execute emergency procedures. Attempt to restart hydraulic systems. Already tried, Tower. No response. I'm going to have to punch out. Negative, Bird 9. You're overpopulated areas. Stay with the aircraft and try to guide it away from the town." Amara felt her heart hammering. She knew exactly where Bird 9 was. The approach pattern would have him east of the base, over the outskirts of Dustwell, the small town where she lived. 3,000 people lived there, mostly families of base personnel and retirees. She grabbed Ramirez's tablet and pulled up the tactical display, tracking Bird 9's position. The aircraft was at 8,000 feet, descending rapidly, on a trajectory that would bring it down right in the middle of Dustwell's residential district. "He needs to eject now," Amara said urgently. "That aircraft is going to come down hard and fast. If he waits too long, he won't have altitude for his chute to deploy properly." "The general ordered him to stay with it," Ramirez said. "The general is wrong. At his current descent rate and trajectory, he's got maybe 90 seconds before he's too low to eject safely." Colonel Vance stared at her. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've calculated bailout windows from damaged aircraft more times than I can count." Amara's voice rose with urgency. "Someone needs to tell that pilot to eject right now before it's too late." Vance grabbed his radio. "General, this is Colonel Vance on the ground. We have a civilian here who's providing tactical analysis. She's saying Bird 9 needs to eject immediately or he'll be below minimum safe altitude." "A civilian?" Aldridge's voice carried pure contempt even in the middle of the crisis. "Colonel, I don't have time for amateur opinions. Bird 9, maintain aircraft control and attempt to guide away from populated areas." "Sir, I'm trying, but I have no control authority. This thing is falling like a rock." Amara looked at the display. 70 seconds. She made a decision that would change everything. She grabbed Vance's radio from his hand, keyed the transmit button, and spoke with the voice of command she hadn't used in 18 months. "Bird 9, this is Lieutenant Commander Sterling. You need to eject immediately. You are 45 seconds from minimum safe ejection altitude. Get out of that aircraft now." The radio went silent for a heartbeat. Then Aldridge's voice exploded across the channel. "Who the hell is on this frequency? Identify yourself immediately. Bird 9, acknowledge." Amara ignored Aldridge completely. "Eject, eject, eject. Who is Lieutenant Commander Sterling?" Bird 9's voice, confused but desperate. "Someone who's trying to save your life. Your aircraft is gone. Save yourself. Punch out now." For 3 seconds nothing happened. Amara watched. The display, Watch the altitude numbers dropping. Watch the trajectory line creeping toward the center of dust well. Then, "This is Bird 9, I'm punching out." The display showed Bird 9's transponder suddenly separate from the main aircraft signal. The ejection seat had fired. 8 seconds later, the F-16 impacted in an open field 2 miles east of Dustwell, the explosion visible even from Redstone's tarmac. The fireball rose 300 feet into the desert sky, black smoke billowing in the morning heat, but the pilot's parachute was visible, drifting safely down into the scrubland, far enough from the impact site to be clear of danger. Amara handed the radio back to Vance, her hand shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to ebb. The colonel was staring at her with an expression that mixed awe and confusion. "Lieutenant Commander Sterling," he said slowly. "That's a Navy rank." "Yes, sir." "Your Navy?" "Was Navy, 14 years. FA 18 pilot, 2 combat deployments. Top gun instructor." The words came out flat, exhausted. "I left the service 18 months ago and came here to hide from all of it." Ramirez was shaking his head in disbelief. "You've been mopping floors. You're one of the most qualified pilots in the country, and you've been mopping our floors." "I didn't want to be a pilot anymore," Amara said quietly. "I wanted to be someone who couldn't make decisions that got people killed." "You just saved that pilot's life," Vance said. "I also tried to stop this entire disaster before it started." Nobody wanted to listen to a janitor. The radio crackled again. "Tower, this is Bird 7. Hydraulic pressure critical. I don't think I'm going to make it back to base." The crisis wasn't over. 9 aircraft were still airborne, all of them damaged. To varying degrees, all of them fighting to make it home. Aldridge's voice came over the radio, and the arrogance was completely gone now, replaced by something that might have been desperation. "Bird 7, try to maintain altitude. We're coordinating emergency landing options." Vance looked at Amara. Really looked at her, seeing her completely for the first time. "Can you help us get these pilots down safely?" It was the question Amara had been dreading for 18 months. The invitation to step back into the role she'd abandoned, to accept responsibility for lives again, to risk making the kind of mistake that haunted her nightmares. She thought about Kai Nakamura, about 3 seconds of hesitation that cost him 8 months of freedom. She thought about all the reasons she'd walked away from command. Then she looked at the display showing 9 aircraft struggling to survive. Because someone in authority had refused to listen to expertise. "Yes," she said simply, "I can help." Vance handed her his radio. "Then do it. Whatever you need, whatever authority you require, you have it. Get our people home." Amara took the radio, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. She looked up at the tower where Aldridge stood, knowing he could see her, knowing this moment would destroy whatever authority he had left. Then she keyed the transmit button and spoke with the voice of a commander who'd just come out of hiding. "All aircraft, this is Lieutenant Commander Amara Sterling, call sign Revenant. I'm assuming tactical advisory for emergency recovery operations. If you want to live through the next 20 minutes, you're going to do exactly what I say." The silence on the radio stretched for 3 heartbeats before Lieutenant Commander Cross's voice came through, steady and professional. "Revenant, this is Lead Bird. Authentication code Sierra Whiskey 379er. Amara felt a rush of relief. Cross was asking for her authentication code standard military protocol to verify she was actually a qualified pilot and not some random person who'd grabbed a radio. He was giving her the chance to prove her credentials before the other pilots, committed to following her instructions, but she'd been out of active service for 18 months. Her codes would be expired. Then she remembered, Top Gun instructors were assigned permanent authentication codes that never expired, a legacy protocol from the program's earliest days. Hers had been based on her call sign and date of qualification. Lead Bird, authenticate Revenant, 12-November-2-1000-8. Double quotes, another pause. Cross would be checking the format against standard Top Gun authentication patterns. Then his voice came back with a note of surprise mixed with respect. Authentication confirmed. Revenant, Lead Bird acknowledges your tactical advisory authority. What are your instructions? In the tower, Amara could see Aldridge grab his own radio, could see his mouth moving in what was certainly a furious objection. But Colonel Vance had already grabbed the tower's internal phone and was clearly overriding him, probably threatening to relieve him of command if he interfered with emergency recovery operations. Amara pushed the politics from her mind and focused on what mattered: 9 damaged aircraft, varying levels of hydraulic failure, and pilots who needed to get on the ground safely. All aircraft, report your hydraulic pressure levels and control responsiveness on my count. Lead Bird, you're first. Lead Bird showing 62% hydraulic pressure. Controls responsive but heavy. Bird 2, 85% pressure. Minor control lag. Bird 4, 70% pressure. Moderate control degradation. Bird 5, 38% pressure, severe control degradation. Flying on backup systems. Bird 6, 55% pressure, moderate lag. Bird 7, 22% pressure, critical degradation. Barely maintaining level flight. The reports continued. By the time all 9 aircraft had checked in, Amara had a complete picture of the situation. 3 aircraft with critical hydraulic issues that needed to land immediately. 4 with moderate damage that could make it back, but would need careful handling. 2 with minor damage that were relatively stable. "All right, listen carefully," Amara said, her voice calm and authoritative. "We're going to land you in order of most critical damage first. Bird 7 and Bird 5, your priority 1. Bird 8, your priority 2. The rest of you will hold in a pattern over the western sector where the air is stable." "Revenant, this is Bird 7, came the shaky voice of Lieutenant Sarah Chun. "I don't know if I can hold a pattern. This aircraft is fighting me on every input. You won't have to hold, Bird 7. You're landing first. What's your current altitude and position?" 6,000 feet, 12 miles northeast of base. "Good. Start a gentle descent to 4,000 feet. Don't make any sharp control inputs. Think of it like flying with your fingertips, not your whole hand. The less you fight the aircraft, the less hydraulic pressure you'll burn." Amara could hear the strain in Chun's breathing over the radio. The young pilot was terrified, and she had every right to be. Flying an F-16 with critical hydraulic failure was like trying to steer a car with broken power steering at 100 miles an hour possible, but requiring perfect technique and nerve. "Ramirez," Amara said, turning to the technical sergeant, "I need you to get me the exact maintenance status of Bird 7. What systems were skipped during the pre-flight checks?" Ramirez was already pulling up the data. Hydraulic system verification, backup system test, and flight control calibration. All marked as deferred for post-flight inspection, which means her backup systems might not be fully functional either. Amara keyed the radio again. "Bird 7, have you tested your emergency backup hydraulic system?" "Negative, Revenant." "Should I activate it now?" "No, your backup might be compromised. If you activate it and it fails, you could lose what little hydraulic pressure you have left. Stay on your primary system and prepare for a manual landing." Manual landing. The words sent a chill through everyone listening. It meant Chun would have to land the aircraft using brute force on the control stick, fighting against a system that was designed to be hydraulically assisted. It required perfect timing, perfect approach angle, and nerves of steel. "Revenant, I've never done a manual landing." Chun's voice cracked slightly. "That wasn't part of my training curriculum." "It's part of it now," Amara said firmly but not unkindly. "I'm going to talk you through every step." "You're at 4,000 feet now?" "Affirmative." "Descending through 4,200. "Good. Continue descent to 3000 and start your turn toward the western approach vector. Make the turn as wide and gentle as possible. Don't bank more than 15 degrees. Amara watched the tactical display as Chen's aircraft began its turn. The movement was jerky, the flight path showing the pilot's struggle to maintain control. But Chen was doing it. Colonel Vance had appeared beside Amara with a headset connected to the tower's communication system. "The general wants to speak with you," he said quietly. "Tell the general I'm busy saving his pilots' lives. He can speak to me when they're all on the ground." Vance's expression showed the barest hint of a smile. "That's what I told him. He's been ordered by his superiors to stand down and let you handle recovery operations." Apparently, someone in the Pentagon heard about the situation and made some very pointed phone calls about authority versus competence. "Bird 7. You're turning too tight," Amara said, seeing the aircraft's bank angle increase on the display. "Shallow it out. Remember, gentle inputs." "Trying, but the aircraft wants to roll further. It's like the controls are fighting me." "That's because your hydraulic system is failing unevenly. The actuators on your right side are degrading faster than your left. Compensate by adding slight left pressure to keep your wings level." "How do you know which side is failing?" "Because I can see your flight path deviation on the tactical display. And I've seen this exact failure pattern before." Amara didn't mention that she'd seen it in a combat situation over hostile territory, or that the pilot in that case had successfully landed despite having burns on both hands from an electrical fire. Some details didn't help. "You're doing fine, Chen. Keep that descent rate steady." Technical Sergeant Ramirez was coordinating with the emergency crews, making sure crash and rescue teams were positioned along the runway. Fire trucks were already rolling into position, their lights flashing in the desert morning. "Bird 7, you're at 3,000 feet, 10 miles out," Amara continued. "Start reducing your airspeed to 180 knots. Deploy your speed brakes halfway. Speed brakes deployed. Airspeed decreasing. Good. Now listen carefully because this is important. On final approach, you're going to have almost no hydraulic assist for your landing gear. When you deploy the gear, it's going to drop by gravity and mechanical backup only. The nose gear might not lock properly on the first try. What do I do if it doesn't lock? You'll execute a go-around and we'll try again. But I don't think it'll come to that. The mechanical backup system is independent of hydraulics. It should work. Should? Will, Amara corrected herself, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. It will work. Trust your aircraft, Jen. These jets are built to take damage and keep flying. Should get you home. The other 8 aircraft had formed a loose holding pattern over the western sector, far from the turbulent air that had caused the crisis. Amara could hear their pilots listening to her coaching Chun, could sense them learning from the instructions she was giving. Bird 7, you're 8 miles out, lined up perfectly with the runway. Start your final descent. Target altitude at the threshold is 50 feet. Airspeed 140 knots. Descending. Airspeed 140. Deploy landing gear now. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Then Chin's voice, tight with relief, gear down and locked. All 3 green lights. On the tarmac, Amara could see Chun's F-16 approaching from the west. Lower and slower than a normal approach, the landing gear extended like the talons of a descending hawk. The aircraft was stable, Chun's control inputs small and precise despite the degraded hydraulics. You're looking good, Bird 7. Maintain your glide slope. Don't try to flare too early, you won't have the hydraulic response for corrections. Let the aircraft sink until you're 20 feet above the runway, then gradually pull back on the stick. It's going to take more force than you're used to, understood? The F-16 crossed the runway threshold at exactly 50 feet, perfectly centered on the white painted lines. Chun began her flare at 20 feet just as instructed, and Amara could see the nose coming up. The sink rate decreasing. The main landing gear touched first with a puff of rubber smoke. Then the nose gear settled onto the concrete with surprising gentleness. The aircraft rolled down the runway, Chun applying brakes with careful precision, and came to a complete stop 3,000 feet down the runway. Bird 7 is on the ground. Chun's voice carried overwhelming relief. I'm safe. Oh my God, I'm safe. Around Amara, the people on the tarmac erupted in cheers. Emergency crews rushed toward the aircraft, but it was clear Chun didn't need them. She'd made a perfect landing under impossible conditions. Outstanding work, Bird 7, Amara said, allowing herself a small smile. Clear the runway and shut down. Bird 5, you're up next. Let's bring you home. For the next hour, Amara talked 8 more aircraft safely onto the ground. Each landing was different, each pilot requiring different coaching based on their specific damage and skill level. Bird 5 needed constant reassurance. Bird 8 required more technical hydraulic management. Bird 11 had to deal with a stuck flap that created asymmetric lift dot, but every single pilot listened to her instructions without question. They heard the absolute confidence in her voice, the deep well of experience that made her directions sound less like suggestions and more like mathematical certainties. When she told them they would land safely, they believed her because she spoke with the authority of someone who'd been exactly where they were and knew the way home. The last aircraft, Bird 11, touched down at 9:47 a.m., 97 minutes after the first emergency call. As the pilot shut down his engine and climbed out of the cockpit, the entire base seemed to exhale collectively. 9 aircraft damaged. 2 complete losses, including Bird 3 that had crashed in the desert. But 12 pilots alive, every single one who'd made it back to the pattern safely on the ground. Amara handed the radio back to Colonel Vance and realized her hands were shaking with adrenaline crash. She'd been running on pure focus for over an hour, and now that the immediate crisis was over, the weight of what had just happened was settling on her shoulders. That was incredible, Vance said quietly. I've been in military aviation for 23 years, and I've never seen crisis management like that. It was necessary, Amara replied. That's all. It was more than necessary. It was masterful. Vance paused. The general wants to see you. And so do a lot of other people. Word of what just happened has reached every level of command up to and including the Joint Chiefs. Amara looked toward the tower where General Aldridge stood at the window. His posture rigid, his face unreadable from this distance. I suppose I can't hide anymore, she said softly. No, Vance agreed. I don't think you can. The Janitor just became the most famous pilot in the Air Force. I'm not Air Force, I'm Navy. Right now, Vance said with a slight smile, I think you're whatever the military needs you to be. Come on, let's go face the music. As they walked toward the operations center, Amara caught sight of Technical Sergeant Ramirez organizing the maintenance teams for aircraft recovery. He looked up, caught her eye, and offered a salute, not the casual acknowledgement given to officers, but the crisp, respectful salute given to someone who'd earned it through action. She returned it automatically. Muscle memory from 14 years of service. The quiet janitor who'd been invisible for 18 months was about to become very visible indeed. And this time, there would be no hiding from who she really was. The operations center conference room felt smaller than it should have with 15 people crammed inside. General Aldridge sat at the head of the long table, his uniform still immaculate despite the chaos of the morning. But his face carried the weight of a man who'd just watched his career catch fire and crash. Amara sat 3 chairs down on his right, still wearing her gray custodial uniform with its faded name tag. The contrast between her work clothes and the dress uniforms around her would have been comical if the situation weren't so grave. Colonel. Vance stood at the front of the room beside a projected screen. showing the timeline of the morning's events. 2 representatives from the Inspector General's office had arrived by helicopter 30 minutes ago, along with a full-bird colonel from Air Combat Command who was recording everything on a military-grade tablet. "Let's begin," said the senior IG representative, a stern woman named Colonel Patricia Whitmore. "General Aldridge, you called this emergency briefing. Please proceed." Aldridge stood, and Amara could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. At approximately 0800 hours this morning, 12 F-16 aircraft launched from Redstone Air Force Base on a training exercise. Due to unforeseen weather conditions and mechanical issues, we experienced multiple in-flight emergencies, resulting in 2 aircraft losses and varying degrees of damage to the remaining 10. Unforeseen weather conditions? Amara heard herself speak before she'd made the conscious decision to do so. "General, with respect, those conditions were very much foreseen. They were documented in weather reports, observed by base personnel, and explicitly warned about by multiple people including myself." Whitmore's sharp eyes fixed on Amara. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Commander Amara Sterling, United States Navy, retired. Currently employed as custodial staff at this facility." The room went silent. Whitmore consulted her tablet, clearly pulling up Amara's service record. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Top Gun instructor. 14 years naval aviation. Over 1,500 flight hours including combat operations." Whitmore looked up. "And you're working as a janitor?" "Yes, ma'am." "We'll come back to that. You said you warned about the weather conditions?" "Multiple times, ma'am. I identified wind shear patterns that would create dangerous conditions for the planned eastern approach vectors. I also warned that the accelerated maintenance schedule was skipping critical safety verifications that could lead to hydraulic system failures." Aldridge's jaw tightened. Those warnings came from an unidentified civilian with no apparent credentials. "At the time, there was no reason to believe. I used military tactical hand signals," Amara interrupted quietly. "I provided specific technical details about hydraulic systems and weather patterns. I called the weather service and the tower operations with explicit warnings. And I was ignored because I was wearing a custodial uniform instead of a flight suit." Colonel Vance stepped forward. "General, I attempted to relay those warnings to you personally. You dismissed them without investigation, because they came from unauthorized sources." Aldridge's composure cracked slightly. "You can't expect me to halt military operations every time a civilian makes a claim about aircraft safety, even when that civilian demonstrates knowledge that no ordinary person would possess." Whitmore's tone was razor-sharp. "General, help me understand your decision-making process. You had explicit warnings about dangerous conditions from someone using military terminology and tactical knowledge. What steps did you take to verify or investigate those warnings before proceeding with the launch?" Aldridge sat back down heavily. "None. I assumed it was interference from someone without proper qualifications." "You assumed." Whitmore made a note. "Lieutenant Commander Sterling, what happened after the aircraft launched?" Amara walked through the entire sequence, the hydraulic failures, the emergency landings, her decision to reveal her identity and take tactical command of the recovery operation. She spoke calmly and factually, without embellishment or blame. When she finished, Whitmore turned to Colonel Vance. "Colonel, you authorized Lieutenant Commander Sterling to assume tactical advisory authority during the crisis. On what basis?" "On the basis that she clearly knew what she was doing, ma'am. She'd accurately predicted every problem that occurred, and she was the most qualified person available to coordinate the emergency response." "Even though she had no official standing at this base?" "Even though," Vance said firmly. "Ma'am, I've been in the Air Force for 23 years. I know expertise when I see it, regardless of what uniform someone's wearing. Lieutenant Commander Sterling saved lives this morning. That's indisputable." Whitmore consulted her notes again. I'm reading reports that all 9 aircraft that made it back to the pattern landed safely under her guidance. 0 additional casualties despite critical system failures. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am, Vance confirmed. The IG officer turned to Aldridge. General, in your professional opinion, what would the outcome have been if Lieutenant Commander Sterling had not intervened? It was the question everyone in the room wanted answered. Aldridge was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. We likely would have lost additional aircraft, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. And possibly pilots. How many? I don't know. 2, maybe 3 more losses. Maybe worse. Whitmore let that hang in the air before continuing. So to summarize, you ignored multiple warnings from qualified personnel, launched aircraft with incomplete safety checks into dangerous weather conditions, refused to delay operations when explicitly warned about the risks, and when the predicted disaster occurred, it was only prevented from becoming catastrophic by the intervention of someone you dismissed as unqualified. Have I understood correctly? Yes, ma'am. Aldridge's voice was hollow. General Aldridge, you are hereby relieved of command at Redstone Air Force Base, pending completion of this investigation. Colonel Vance will assume temporary command effective immediately. The words were delivered without emotion, but their impact was absolute. Aldridge's face went gray. In the military, being relieved of command wasn't just a professional setback, it was the end of a career. Whitmore turned to Amara. Lieutenant Commander Sterling, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Why were you working as a janitor when you have qualifications that would make you valuable to virtually any aviation organization in the country? Amara had known this question was coming, but that didn't make it easier to answer. In 2022, I was leading a combat air patrol mission over hostile territory. My wingman was shot down by surface-to-air missiles. I hesitated for 3 seconds before calling in his position, because I was trying to assess whether I could attempt to rescue myself. Those 3 seconds allowed enemy forces to reach him first. He spent 8 months as a prisoner of war. The official report cleared you of any wrongdoing, Whitmore said, clearly having already reviewed the incident. The official report was wrong. I made a command decision that cost my wingman his freedom. I couldn't live with that responsibility anymore, so I walked away from flying and came here to work as a janitor. I came here to be someone who couldn't make life or death decisions anymore. I thought if I stayed away from command, I couldn't hurt anyone else. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. Lieutenant Commander, I've reviewed the incident you're describing. Your wingman, Lieutenant Nakamura, filed a statement after his release. He specifically said that your 3-second delay likely saved your life and allowed you to call inaccurate coordinates that enabled his eventual rescue. He recommended you for a commendation, not censure. Amara felt like she'd been punched in the chest. What? He said, and I quote, Commander Sterling's tactical assessment under fire demonstrated exactly the kind of disciplined decision-making that the Navy needs in combat pilots. Her coordinates were so precise that rescue forces were able to locate me within hours of my release. She saved my life by not throwing hers away. Whitmore set down her tablet. You've been punishing yourself for 18 months for a decision that the person you think you failed credits with saving his life. The conference room was absolutely silent. Amara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. That changes nothing about this morning, Amara said, her voice rough. I tried to warn about the dangers and was ignored. People could have died because someone in authority wouldn't listen to expertise that didn't come with the right credentials. You're absolutely correct, Whitmore agreed. Which is why we're here. This incident represents a systemic failure in how civilian expertise is integrated into military operations. General Aldridge made catastrophic errors in judgment, but he was operating within a culture that prioritizes rank over competence. She turned to address the full room. This is going to be a wake-up call for the entire Air Force. We're going to establish new protocols for evaluating safety warnings regardless of source. We're going to mandate verification procedures before dismissing technical concerns. And we're going to make sure that qualified personnel are recognized and utilized effectively, whether they're wearing 4 stars or a custodial uniform. Aldridge spoke up, his voice defeated but steady. Colonel Whitmore, I take full responsibility for my failures. But I want it on record that Lieutenant Commander Sterling's actions this morning were exemplary. She demonstrated extraordinary skill, courage, and judgment. Whatever consequences I face are deserved. She deserves recognition. It was the closest thing to an apology Amara was likely to get from him. And she could see the effort it cost him to say it. That recognition is already being arranged, Whitmore said. Lieutenant Commander, the Secretary of the Navy has been briefed on your actions. You're being recalled to active duty for a formal commendation ceremony. After that, you'll have some decisions to make about your future. Ma'am, I didn't intervene this morning to get back into the military. I intervened because people needed help. I understand that. But the military needs people like you, people who act when action is needed, who speak up when speaking up can save lives, who put the mission and the people above their own career concerns. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. You've spent 18 months hiding from responsibility. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and accept that command isn't about being perfect. It's about making the best decisions you can with the information you have. And learning from the times when you're wrong. Amara looked at General Aldridge, saw him processing those same words. Saw him recognizing the lesson he'd learned at catastrophic cost. What happens to the general? Amara asked. That depends on the investigation's findings and his chain of command. But his career as a tactical commander is over. Whitmore glanced at Aldridge. However, I'm recommending him for reassignment to a training position where he can teach future officers about the importance of recognizing expertise and listening to warnings regardless of their source. His failure can become a teaching tool that prevents future disasters. It was both punishment and redemption, a way for Aldridge to rebuild from his mistakes rather than simply being discarded. The general looked at Amara directly for the first time since the meeting began. I'm sorry, he said simply. You tried to help and I made you an enemy because of my own arrogance. I was wrong. Amara nodded slowly. We were both wrong, General. You assumed credentials mattered more than competence. I assumed hiding was safer than engaging. We both learned better today. Colonel Vance stepped forward. Lieutenant Commander, regardless of what you decide about your military career, I want to offer you a position here at Redstone. We need a civilian aviation safety advisor, someone who can evaluate our operations without being bound by military hierarchy. Someone who pilots and commanders will actually listen to because they've proven their expertise. Interested? It was an elegant solution, a way to use her skills without the burden of command. A position of influence without the weight of ultimate responsibility. I'll think about it, Amara said. That's all I ask. The meeting continued for another hour, documenting details and establishing timelines for the formal investigation. But the important questions had been answered, and the path forward had been established. When it finally ended and people began filing out, Technical Sergeant Ramirez appeared in the doorway. Ma'am, there are about 40 pilots out on the tarmac who'd like to speak with you. They're calling it a thank you formation. Amara followed him outside to find not just pilots, but maintenance crews, operations personnel, and even some of the custodial staff lined up in neat rows. When she appeared, someone called out, "Attention!" And every person in uniform snapped to rigid posture. Lieutenant Commander Cross stepped forward and saluted. Ma'am, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for bringing us home. Amara returned the salute. And for the first time in 18 months, It didn't feel like she was pretending to be something she wasn't. It felt like coming home. 6 months had passed since the morning that changed everything at Redstone Air Force Base. Amara stood in the civilian aviation safety office, her office now reviewing the latest operational reports. The space was modest but functional, with large windows overlooking the flight line where F-16s conducted their daily training exercises. On the wall behind her desk hung 2 photographs, one of her old naval squadron from 2015, and one taken 3 weeks ago showing her standing with the 9 pilots she'd talked down during the crisis. Between those photos hung a framed commendation from the Secretary of the Navy, recognizing her actions during the emergency. She rarely looked at it. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Technical Sergeant Ramirez entered carrying a tablet and 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, Commander," he said, using the title she'd asked him not to use, but which had stuck anyway. "Got the weekly safety audit results. Thought you might want to review them over caffeine." "You're a lifesaver, Ramirez." Amara accepted the coffee gratefully. "What's the verdict?" "Perfect compliance on all hydraulic system checks, full weather briefings completed before every flight operation, and 0 incidents of maintenance protocols being skipped or deferred." He grinned. "Turns out when you almost lose a dozen aircraft in one morning, people start taking safety procedures seriously. That's not funny. Little bit funny. In a dark, lesson-learned kind of way." Amara reviewed the data on his tablet, nodding with satisfaction. The new protocols she'd helped develop were working exactly as intended. Every safety warning was now logged and investigated, regardless of source. Maintenance checks had mandatory verification steps that couldn't be overridden without written justification, reviewed by 3 separate supervisors. And most importantly, there was a direct hotline to the base safety office that anyone, military or civilian, could use to report concerns anonymously. "How's the new base commander working out?" Amara asked. "Colonel Vance?" "He's solid. Actually listens to people, values expertise over ego, encourages questions instead of punishing them." Ramirez paused. "Kind of the opposite of Aldridge in every way that matters." Amara had heard that General Aldridge was now teaching at the Air Force Academy, specifically courses on leadership failures and crisis management. His fall from command had been complete, but he'd been given the chance to rebuild by teaching others not to make his mistakes. She'd received a handwritten letter from him 2 months ago, a genuine apology that acknowledged not just what had happened, but why it had happened and what he was doing to ensure he never led that way again. She'd written back, accepting the apology. "Some wounds healed better when you let them." "Speaking of listening to people," Ramirez said, "I've got 3 pilots who want to consult with you about weather patterns for next week's night operations. And the maintenance chief needs your input on a new diagnostic protocol for hydraulic systems. Tell them I'm available after lunch." "Anything else?" "Yeah, actually." Ramirez's expression shifted to something more serious. "There's someone here to see you. Says he served with you in the Navy. Lieutenant Kai Nakamura." Amara's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. She hadn't seen Nakamura since the day she'd resigned her commission, hadn't spoken to him since his release from captivity. The guilt she'd carried for 18 months had been partially eased by learning he didn't blame her. But facing him in person was something she'd been avoiding. "Send him in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Nakamura walked through the door moments later, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a casual button-down shirt. He looked good, healthy, the haunted expression she remembered from the debriefing photos replaced by something calmer. He smiled when he saw her. "Commander Sterling. Or should I say, the woman who stopped hiding." "Kai." Amara stood, unsure whether to salute, shake hands, or just stand there awkwardly. He solved the problem by pulling her into a brief, professional hug. "It's good to see you," he said. "Really good." I heard about what happened here, saw the news coverage, read the official reports. Apparently, you saved a bunch of pilots by being exactly who you've always been. I just did what needed doing. Yeah, that's what you always say. Nakamura settled into the chair across from her desk. But we both know it's more than that. You saw a problem, recognized the danger, and acted even when nobody wanted to listen. That's who you are, Amara. That's who you've always been. Even when my actions get people captured by enemy forces. Especially then. His tone was gentle but firm. You know, I filed a statement after my release, right? Did you ever actually read it? Colonel Whitmore quoted from it during the investigation. But did you read the whole thing? When Amara shook her head, Nakamura pulled out his phone and scrolled through his files. Here, this is what I wrote. Commander Sterling's tactical decision-making under extreme pressure demonstrated the highest standards of naval aviation. Her 3-second assessment before calling in coordinates showed discipline rather than hesitation. Had she immediately attempted a rescue, we likely both would have been captured or killed. Her precise positioning data enabled my eventual recovery and proved that sometimes the hardest leadership decision is choosing not to act rashly. You didn't fail me. Amara, you saved me by keeping your head when everything was going to hell. Amara felt 18 months of guilt crack like ice under spring thaw. I convinced myself I hesitated out of fear. You assessed the situation and made the right call. There's a difference. Nakamura leaned forward. I spent 8 months as a POW, and you know what kept me going. Knowing that you were out there, that you'd gotten the coordinates right. That rescue was possible because you'd done your job perfectly. I never blamed you, not for 1 second. Then why didn't you contact me after you were released? Because you'd already resigned your commission and disappeared. By the time I was cleared to reach out, you'd vanished completely. He smiled sadly. I looked for you, Amara. Took me 6 months to track you down to this base, and another 3 months to work up the courage to show up. Why now? Because I saw the news about Redstone, saw you finally stepping back into who you really are. And I thought maybe you were ready to hear what I should have told you years ago. You're a good pilot, a good commander, and a good person. What happened to me wasn't your fault, and the fact that you carried that guilt for so long just proves that you care more about your people than yourself. That's exactly who should be making command decisions. Amara found herself blinking back tears. I don't know if I can go back to combat aviation. The weight of those decisions. Then don't, Nakamura interrupted. What you're doing here is important. You're making military aviation safer. You're teaching people to listen and learn. You're preventing the kind of disasters that happened because someone's ego got in the way of their judgment. He gestured to the window overlooking the flight line. Those pilots out there trust you because you proved you care about getting them home safely. That matters, Amara. It matters a lot. They talked for another hour, filling in the gaps of 18 months, sharing stories and healing wounds that had festered in silence. When Nakamura finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. One more thing. I'm flight instructing now at Miramar. If you ever decide you want to get back in a cockpit, not for combat, just for the joy of flying, I'd be honored to be your wingman again. After he left, Amara sat at her desk for a long time, looking at the photographs on her wall. The old squadron photo showed her younger self, confident and unburdened by the weight of mistakes not yet made. The recent photo showed her as she was now older, marked by experience, but surrounded by people she'd helped save. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Vance. Briefing at 1400. Need your assessment on new pilot training protocols. Your input is valued. Your input is valued. 4 words that would have changed everything 6 months ago if General Aldridge had been capable of saying them. Amara pulled up the training protocols and began her review, marking sections that needed revision, noting safety concerns, and drafting recommendations. It was detail-oriented work, unglamorous and often tedious. But it was work that saved lives by preventing problems before they started. At 1:45 p.m. She walked into the briefing room to find not just Colonel Vance, but a dozen senior officers from bases across the region. They'd come to Redstone specifically to learn about the new safety protocols, to understand how civilian expertise could be integrated into military operations, and to hear from the woman who'd turned a potential catastrophe into a teaching moment that was changing Air Force culture. "Commander Sterling," Vance said as she entered, "thank you for joining us. Gentlemen, this is the architect of the safety protocols we've been discussing. I'll let her explain how they work." Amara spent the next 2 hours presenting her systems, answering questions, and demonstrating how the protocols created multiple layers of safety verification without significantly impacting operational efficiency. The officers listened attentively, took notes, asked intelligent questions, and treated her expertise with the respect it deserved. When the briefing concluded, a brigadier general from Nellis Air Force Base approached her. "Commander, I'm standing up a new aviation safety division at Nellis. We're looking for someone to lead it, someone with combat experience, technical expertise, and a proven track record of disaster prevention. Interested?" It was a significant offer. Nellis was one of the most important Air Force bases in the country, home to advanced training programs and cutting aviation operations. Leading their safety division would give her influence over Air Force-wide policies and practices. "That's a generous offer, General. Can I think about it?" "Take your time. But know that what you've built here at Redstone is exactly what the Air Force needs across the board. We'd be lucky to have you." That evening, Amara sat in her small apartment, the same one she'd rented 18 months ago when she'd arrived in, Dustwell, looking for somewhere to hide. The space was still modest, still sparsely furnished, but it no longer felt like a refuge from responsibility. It felt like a base camp, a place to rest between missions. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from aviation, organizations offering consulting positions, 2 from defense contractors seeking safety advisors, and 1 from the Navy asking if she'd consider returning to active duty as a flight instructor. 6 months ago, she would have ignored all of them, would have hidden behind her custodial uniform and told herself she was protecting others by refusing to engage, but 18 months of penance hadn't protected anyone. It had just removed her skills and experience from places where they could have prevented disasters. What had protected people was stepping forward when action was needed, speaking up when silence was easier, and accepting that leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about caring enough to try, and being wise enough to learn from failure. Amara opened her laptop and began drafting a response to the Nellis offer. Outlining her conditions, she would lead the safety division, but she wanted authority to implement protocols across all Air Combat Command bases, wanted direct reporting access to senior leadership when safety concerns emerged, and wanted the ability to recruit civilian experts into advisory roles regardless of their official credentials. If they accepted, she could scale what she'd built at Redstone across the entire Air Force, could create a culture where safety warnings were investigated rather than dismissed, where expertise was recognized regardless of rank or uniform, and where preventing disasters mattered more than protecting egos. Before she sent the email, she pulled up a different message, one she'd been drafting for weeks, but had never had the courage to send. It was addressed to her old squadron commander, the one who'd tried to convince her not to resign after Nakamura's capture. "Sir," it read, "I'm finally ready to stop hiding. If the offer to return to the reserves is still open, I'd like to discuss options. Not for combat deployment. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for that again, but for training and safety advisory roles where I can help the next generation of pilots avoid the mistakes I made and recognize the warning signs I missed. I'm learning that running from responsibility doesn't protect anyone. Engaging with it, learning from it, and teaching others from that experience. That's what actually keeps people safe. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. 3 days later, Amara stood on the Redstone tarmac watching a formation of F-16s execute a perfect takeoff sequence. The weather was clear, all maintenance checks were complete, and the pilots had been thoroughly briefed on conditions and procedures. Technical Sergeant Ramirez stood beside her, tablet in hand, monitoring the telemetry data streaming from each aircraft. "Looking good," he said. "All systems nominal, flight paths perfect. No anomalies detected." "That's how it's supposed to work," Amara replied. "Yeah, but 6 months ago, we didn't know what supposed to work actually looked like. You taught us that." A vehicle pulled up behind them, a staff car with Navy markings. Amara turned to see a rear admiral climb out, his uniform decorated with ribbons that marked decades of distinguished service. She recognized him immediately, Rear Admiral Marcus Webb, her former commanding officer, the man who'd tried to stop her from resigning. "Permission to come aboard, Commander?" he asked with a slight smile. "This is Air Force territory, Admiral. I think the Navy's protocols don't apply." "Then I'll just say, it's good to see you again, Amara." They walked together to her office, and Webb laid out a proposal that took her breath away. The Navy wanted to create a new position, Director of Aviation Safety and Training, Integration, that would work across all service branches to implement the kind of protocols Amara had pioneered at Redstone. It would come with a promotion to full commander, a team of specialists under her direction, and the authority to mandate changes when safety concerns warranted. "You'd be protecting pilots across the entire military," Webb said. "Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army Aviation, all of them would benefit from what you've learned. And you'd be doing it without having to carry the burden of combat command again. Just expertise, oversight, and the authority to make sure people listen when warnings are issued." It was everything she'd hoped to build, scaled beyond anything she'd imagined possible. "What about General Aldridge?" Amara asked. "His case is still being held up as an example of failed leadership. If I take this position, I'll effectively be building my career on his mistakes." "You'll be building your career on lessons learned," Webb corrected. "Aldridge made catastrophic errors in judgment, but he's taking responsibility and using his experience to teach others. You're doing the same thing from the other side, showing what right looks like. That's not exploitation, Amara. That's progress." She thought about the janitor who'd arrived at Redstone 18 months ago, carrying guilt and hiding from responsibility. Thought about the 9 pilots who were alive because she'd stopped hiding long enough to act. Thought about Nakamura's words, "You saved me by doing your job perfectly." "I'll accept on one condition," Amara said. "I want General Aldridge involved in the training program. He can teach the failure side, what happens when authority dismisses expertise. I'll teach the recovery side how to build systems that prevent those failures. Together, we can give people the complete picture." Webb considered this, then nodded. "I'll make it happen." "When can you start?" "Give me 2 weeks to transition my responsibilities here and brief my replacement. After that, I'm ready." After Webb left, Amara stood at her office window one last time, watching the aircraft that had become such a familiar sight. In 2 weeks, she'd be in Washington, D.C., working at the Pentagon, shaping aviation safety policy for the entire United States. Military. The quiet janitor who tried to disappear had instead become impossible to ignore, and maybe, she thought, that was exactly how it should be. Hiding hadn't protected anyone. Engaging, teaching, learning, and building better systems, that was what actually saved lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nakamura. "Heard about your new position. Proud of you. Let's go flying sometime." "Just for fun." Amara smiled and typed back, "I'd like that." "Been too long since I flew just for the joy of it." She locked her office door and walked across the tarmac toward her car, passing groups of pilots preparing for evening operations. Several of them nodded respectfully as she passed. One Lieutenant Chun, who'd made the terrifying manual landing 6 months ago, stopped her. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you again. Not just for talking me down that day, but for everything you've built here. I feel safer flying now because I know the system actually cares about keeping us alive." "That's all any of us want," Amara replied. "Safe flights, Chun. Safe flights, Commander." As Amara drove away from Redstone for one of the last times as a permanent fixture there, she realized she'd finally made peace with who she was. Not the perfect pilot who never made mistakes. Not the failed commander who'd cost her wingman his freedom. Not the janitor hiding from responsibility. She was Amara Sterling, a pilot who'd learned from her mistakes. A leader who'd found the courage to speak up when others wouldn't listen. And a person committed to making sure that expertise was valued, regardless of where it came from or what uniform it wore. The woman they'd dismissed had proven she was exactly what they needed, and she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.